Binsky will be interviewing Steven Pinker today.
Well, Stephen, thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you here at ISIR, and I must say that I really feel like I'm at an incredible advantage because we are going to get a candid and forthcoming interview this afternoon because Stephen's mother is in the front row. And I have never in my life had a fact checker of this quality. So, Ron, thank you for being here. We're delighted to have you. And I'm going to just dive into your Sunday. Okay? Steve, before we get into the substance of your contributions, we kind of like to get a picture of your academic career and what you feel is important to know about your development up to your PhD. What were some of the key things that happened to get you to that point?
I think I was always interested in human nature, in what makes us tick. And as a student in college, at Dawson College here in Montreal, running the Quebec junior college system, I took courses in a number of disciplines that had something to do with the human mind, anthropology and sociology and philosophy. And psychology seemed to sit at the center. It seemed to be the hub from which all the spokes emanated. On the one hand, it's the human mind that makes many questions in biology interesting. Why are we more interested in the brain than in other organs like the kidney? If there's a decade of the brain, there hasn't been a decade of the kidney. We don't live without kidneys, but brains are kind of interesting because they give rise to minds.
Right.
And some of the most interesting questions in evolution are how did something like human intelligence evolve? In genetics, one of the fascinating questions is how do you get a trillion synapse human brain out of a 20,000 gene genome? In the other direction, a lot of the subject matter of the social sciences and the humanities are, in a sense, applications of psychology. The arts are products of the human mind. The literature, fiction, and poetry are uses of human language. The visual arts very much depend on how our visual system works, and music hinges on our auditory perception. So, social and political questions are questions about how human beings get along, how we implicitly negotiate social contracts, how we enjoy the advantages of living in social groups without being exploited. So psychology seemed to me to be the discipline that really got to the core of human nature and all its manifestations. And I liked psychology because it dealt with endless questions of human nature. Are we basically cooperative? Are we basically competitive? Are we rational? Are we irrational? Of course, the answer to none of these questions is a binary yes or no. But it addressed these profound questions with methods that seemed to be tractable, namely experiments. It was the sweet spot for me.
Okay. And then you developed expertise in cognitive psychology. You made so many diverse contributions. How did someone with your background, someone who at one point in his career, and I'm not putting him on the spot because Stephen has said this publicly, said early on he found individual differences uninteresting. How did someone at that stage of development become so interested in human psychological diversity that you developed expertise in the study of individual differences and wrote a book like Blank Slate? How did that happen?
Well, it's true that at the end of The Language Instinct, my first popular book, I just commented on how one topic that I did not cover in that book and that I had never studied myself up to that point was how we differ, just because the individual differences within the normal range just seemed like a little ripple of noise on top of something interesting that we all had in common. So compared to the question of what makes a brain smart, how do we solve problems, how do we invent things, how do we discover things, what makes some of us a little better than others on a quantitative scale struck me as just less interesting. But then, but I would not have, as you point out, I would not write that today. I do, individual differences are interesting in a number of ways. One of them is, if you're interested in human nature, what is innate across the human species? What makes a human a human? One of the ways to study it is to look at how something varies, since you need some kind of independent variable in science to study anything. So if you're interested in what do the genes install in human nature, you could compare humans to chimpanzees. There are a number of ways of getting at it. But one of them has to be, well, let's look at differences in the genes and see how they correlate with differences in psychological abilities. Another was the fact that something that I didn't appreciate until reading an article by Tom Bouchard and his colleagues in the late 80s in Science that pointed out a problem that I got a deepening appreciation of, which is that behavioral genetics isn't just the study of genetic influences, but it can lead to surprising discoveries about environmental influences, namely the small contribution of the so-called shared environment, which comes as I think came as a surprise to everyone, pointed out by Robert Plomin and Sandra Scarr, David Rowe, and later Judith Harris. One of the profound discoveries of behavioral genetics is not so much that genes matter, though that still comes as a shock to many people, but that the part that isn't genetic isn't necessarily familial, isn't necessarily parental, that there's some profound source of variation in what makes us what we are that is neither genes nor families.
Right.
That's a discovery that I find even almost 15 years after publishing the book. Like, it's very hard to get people to even understand it, let alone try to explain it. But that is a profound intellectual puzzle about what makes us what we are. I have my own favorite hypothesis about it, as best my own interpretation of the evidence, that a lot of it seems is probably neurodevelopmental noise. And so non-shared environment as the name of the variable that accounts for that chunk of variance may be somewhat misleading. But anyway, it's a bit of a digression, but as an answer to your question, it is a highly interesting question of what is it other than our genes that make us what we are, and that's something that could only come to light through behavioral genetics, study of intelligence and personality. And then, of course, there's the evolutionary question. Given that my interest in evolution was answering the why question about how the mind works, not just how does the mind work, but why does the mind work the way it does, as opposed to all the other ways you could imagine it might have worked. The ultimate answer to that lies in large part in evolution. What were the selective forces that gave rise to the human brain? And of course, individual genetic variation is the raw material of evolution. That itself isn't huge. I didn't find hugely interesting, but it does lead to questions as why is there residual variation? Why did natural selection just select for the fittest phenotype, making us all pretty much indistinguishable except for maybe some normal distribution of noise? Now maybe there is nothing but normal distribution of noise, but there are questions that a number of people have raised of what is the best explanation for the variation that we have now? Does it come from selection in different populations, different environments that then merged, kind of mixing together adaptations to heterogeneous environments? Is there frequency-dependent selection so that some traits are useful until they become too common? Is it that I think unlikely that successful societies need mixtures of expertise, and so there's selection at the level of the group? I doubt it, but it's a hypothesis. That itself is another set of interesting hypotheses above and beyond do we vary, and how many dimensions are there?
Right, right. Now, you said so many interesting things in the blank slate. One that jumped out at me and is so relevant to the people attending this conference is the way you sort of chuckled in your book about academics denying the existence of intelligence. And you said they're actually obsessed with intelligence, and they're only all too willing to describe different colleagues in terms of intelligence, contrast themselves others in terms, what is going on here?
Yeah, what would academic gossip be without discussions of ridiculous comparisons of intelligence?
Yeah,
Oh, we gotta hire her, she's really, really smart.
Yeah.
He's hired him on Ellen, yeah.
Huh? What's going on, and have you been able to refine this in any way in the last 15 years?
And I don't think I think the reason that people talk about intelligence is that it should not be any surprise to this group, namely it exists, it varies, and it's important. So you just can't live your life, your day-to-day life, your hiring, your promotions, your dealings with students, on the assumption that we're all indistinguishable. I mean, you'd be out of touch with reality. On the other hand, innate individual differences is an issue that has become politicized for the reasons that I mentioned in the blank slate. Namely, that people conflate the issue of ought we to be fair to everyone, not prejudge anyone, with the question of are we indistinguishable, the contrast between fairness and sameness.
Mm-hmm.
But because of some sensitivity, understandable, that individual differences could be used to fortify a class system, to make invidious justifications for racism or ethnic prejudice, that as a result, the very idea that people could differ innately became moralized and politicized, and then that fed back on the empirical issue, at least when people were in intellectualizing mode. That is, when they were making explicit statements about intelligence, they were on their guard to the political and moral implications, at least what they thought of as the political and moral. But then when intelligence wasn't discussed as a topic, but you were actually dealing with people, you couldn't avoid it, just because people do different intelligence.
Right.
So there is that kind of systematic hypocrisy,
Yeah, interesting.
as there is in a number of other topics.
Sure.
Which
Would you
surrounded by
say-
hypocrisy, yeah.
Yeah.
This-
You know, in preparing for this interview, it occurred to me that you have probably read more of the articles by ISIR members than 99% of academic psychologists. And I was just wondering your take on, is there anything you think the field of intelligence should devote more attention to, or is being conspicuously neglected?
Well, I think it would be, I'm not an expert in the history of, I don't know how you want to characterize the field, whether it's individual differences, psychometrics, behavioral genetics,
Right.
testing, that cluster fields historically seem to have developed separately from mainstream experimental cognitive psychology and
Right.
cognitive neuroscience.
Right.
There have been attempts to unify them. I remember Buzz Hunt
Right.
back in the 1970s, who made a stab, and James Lee, who's here, in his thesis tried to answer the question I think is a profound question of how is this variable that we call intelligence, and a variable is indirectly connected to reality. It's just something that varies. It's a mathematical construct. It pertains to something real. Obviously I don't agree with the critics that say that it's just a fiction of the methods of factor analysis. There is something real there, but what is that real thing in terms of both how it causally allows some minds to solve problems and others fail? That is, what is the actual effect on millisecond by millisecond cognitive processes? And James has argued with some beautiful data that models of millisecond by millisecond decision time that use the metaphor of diffusion, of accumulation of evidence in a kind of random walk, where the available information builds up an internal noisy signal as to whether you believe one thing or another, or decide one thing or another. That the rate of diffusion is what we mean by intelligence, or what we're measuring when we measure differences in intelligence. Anyway, that the attempt to bridge the gap between a dimension of how Lisa differs from Sally, how John differs from Bill, with how does the mind of John, Bill, Lisa, and Sally do anything intelligent. That
Right.
is, I think, is a central scientific challenge. In the other direction, the bridge to evolutionary biology is important. As I mentioned before, you might expect that natural selection would converge on the optimal design, except for maybe random mutations that pop up that take time to eliminate. Is that the architecture of genetic variation? How do we reconcile these two bodies of knowledge, namely behavioral genetics and evolutionary psychology and biology? Again, a topic that James has made an important contribution to. And then in the third direction, how does this relate to differences in the structure of the adult brain, and even more interestingly, the development of the brain in utero in the first years of life? So what does this elixir that we call general intelligence, which again is a mathematical construct, it points to something real. What is that real thing?
And where would you like to see the field be in about 20 years?
So I think new ideas for each of those three questions. Also, the going beyond general intelligence, which is obviously such an powerful vector that it not only soaks up a lot of the variance, but it soaks up a lot of the intellectual energy in the field.
Right.
But clearly, people differ from each other in ways other than just how smart they are.
Right.
And I would like to, especially now that new methods are available for polygenic scores that can look at variation with a suitably large sample size, that we have been kind of submerged in the noise with smaller samples
Right.
of course methods. How can we get a handle on a person who's just verbally really fluent and maybe not so spatially acute, or vice versa?
Right.
In fact, just to go back to your very first question, the reason that the trajectory that led me to an interest in individual differences came in part, and my interest in psychology, came in part from my former colleague at MIT, Noam Chomsky, who I became aware of through an article in the New York Times Magazine in 1972, when I was just a college freshman, on the Chomskyan revolution in linguistics. That was one of the things that got me interested in language and in cognitive science more generally. I never studied with Chomsky, and I was not a colleague of his in the same department, because he's a linguist and a psychologist.
Right.
But the question of, is there an innate faculty of language that accounts for why children universally learn to speak so quickly through casual exposure across all societies in a way that seems independent of the technological sophistication of society, to some extent can dissociate from general intelligence. What's going on there in terms of its genetic architecture? There was hope for, I think, naive hope 25 years ago to find various language gene. We know that that is extraordinarily unlikely.
Right.
But we now, there could be, 100 or 200 or 300 genes that collectively give us the power of language. None of which are indispensable, each one of which makes some small contribution. Because, and that question can be asked of other dimensions of both personality and intelligence. So it'd be nice to see methods develop that could find the source of that variation, both in the genome and in sets of behavioral tests. I guess I'll take another couple of seconds.
Keep going.
It is remarkable that such robust effects in behavioral genetics of intelligence and studying intelligence in general can come from tests that are so theoretical. That is, they're just a bunch of things that some people are better at than others. But the items are rarely selected as kind of probes for particular cognitive components. Now, I think it's a remarkable discovery that despite that, these tests pick up effects that are so robust.
Right.
But it'd be nice, again, to bridge the gap and develop methods that maybe are more acute at finding dimensions of individual variation that may account for less variance than G, but that are probably there, that require more subtlety and sophistication to pick up, both phenotypically and genetically. But I suspect they're there, and it'd be nice to see the field turn in that direction. Now, I take it as kind of a consensus in the field that despite denials outside the field, there are some effects that are so robust that it's getting a little boring to say them over and over again.
Right.
Such as that intelligence exists and it's highly heritable and all of the familiar accomplishments. And so, what are the next steps? How do we go a level deeper and ask questions at the next level of subtlety? Now that that's at least established.
Right. Now, you're especially unique in your work because you have combined your scientific work with writing for the popular press, and I know it's not effortless, but it appears effortless. And how has your experience with the popular press informed you in terms of maximizing the impact of your scientific work? How do you put these two aspects of your career together?
Well, in part, I'm fortunate in that regard, in that the main content area in psychology that I study is language.
Right.
And so the question of how to use language to convey complex concepts there's a certain synergy with the scientific curiosity in how language works in general. So I'm kind of fortunate in what I study is also what I use.
Right.
And they have gone, and I recently brought the two of them together when I tried my hand at writing a style manual, my most recent book called The Sense of Style.
Right.
My subtitle was The Thinking Person's Guide to Writing in the 21st Century, where the thinking person's guide was meant, not just as a little bit of advertising, an advertising gimmick, but because what I hoped was the comparative advantage to that style manual among the competition is that I tried to get at the reasons why certain bits of style advice work and others are superstitions that should be avoided in terms of how the human mind processes language. So it was a psychologically oriented style manual. But I find that there are two ways in which writing for a broad audience, I think, feeds back and improves my basic research. One of them should be familiar to any of you who teach, which is, I assume, almost all of you. Namely, often when you explain your subject matter to intelligent but temporarily ignorant undergraduates, where the best philosophy of teaching is often to assume that your students are smart and curious, but they're just some things they don't know. That your job is to teach them those things. That's similar to the mindset of writing a book for a general audience. And one of the first rules in writing that academics are not really aware of is that writing for general audience does not mean dumbing down or talking down. It means that it's most effective when you assume that your reader is your equal, but they just haven't seen something that you've seen. And your job is to point it out to them.
Right.
Now, so all of you who've taught undergraduates know that sometimes you don't understand your own subject until you try to teach it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who has had the experience of being up at there used to be these things called blackboards. Some of the older people might remember.
Control.
You're up there and you're kind of talking your way through a lesson in your own field and realize, oh my God, what I'm saying doesn't make any sense. I never realized it before. Now it's clear. I just try to kind of bullshit my way through the fact that I don't really understand what I'm saying. or do I confess, I'm gonna say something that doesn't make any sense, and I better go back and learn it better myself. So that kind of experience that many of us have through teaching, I also have very often in writing. Namely, it's only when you try to explain something from first principles to someone who you assume is highly intelligent, and you sometimes realize that your own understanding, maybe your own personal understanding, maybe there's a gap in the field, that your field has never addressed the question. So it helps me in that way get back to basic questions about my own understanding and about the field's understanding. The other thing, ironically, is that I learned is that the degree of fact-checking in academia is quite pitiful.
Yeah.
There are, anywhere from 1 to 4 referees who are not paid, anonymous, have access to mind, have a limited amount of time to spend, and they spend a lot of their energy on, does this finding, if true, make me happy or not? When you write something that gets read by tens or hundreds of thousands of people, many of them eager to prove that the big shot Harvard professor is wrong about something, you get a degree of fact checking that is just unprecedented for an academic. And so I have learned, since being called various errors being pointed out, things that I should have looked up the first time, but I just trusted my own memory, which we all know you should never trust. So I become a much more assiduous fact checker. Ironically, writing for the public compared to just writing for my fellow academics, who let all kinds of things slide that they don't look up. Things like, as Mark Twain said, maybe you should look up to see if Mark Twain really did say that. And he almost certainly didn't.
Since you brought up your book, I have to ask you this, because I suspect some of the people in the audience suffer from this. You talk about the curse of knowledge and how what is that and what can we do to combat it?
So curse of knowledge, it's a term that came from economics, but it refers to a phenomenon that many of us in psychology know by other names, such as egocentrism, such as lack of theory of mind. But it's most generally the difficulty that we all have in knowing what other people know. And in particular, the curse of knowledge refers to the fact that when you know something, it's very difficult to imagine what it's like not to know it. It's very hard to subtract an idea from your own knowledge base and then anticipate what the mindset is of a person who doesn't know that particular fact. And I think that the biggest source of unclarity in writing and communication is the curse of knowledge. The fact that when you write, it's hard to appreciate that what's obvious to you may not be obvious to everyone else.
Right.
So people skip steps in arguments, they describe things generically where the reader needs concrete detail. Talk about the stimulus, or the variable, or the paradigm, or the context. All of these concepts about concepts that are actually kind of meaningless unless you know specifically what's being referred to. Forcing yourself as much as you can, which is not very far, to at least try to anticipate what knows and doesn't know. And since we aren't very good at it, better still to show a copy to other people and take seriously what they're not understanding or what they're missing, because we're not so good at putting ourselves in other people's shoes.
Now, some of us, because we deal with sensitive topics, and when I consulted colleagues about what would be some ideal questions to ask Steven Pinker that would be relevant to the society, to academia in general, the dominant response was, what do we do about the climate in major universities? Tolerant of controversial views and debates and problems with speakers ranging from Charles Murray to Larry Summers and the pushback. It seems like the very concept of a university university was designed to foster this kind of debate. But what is going on? What can we do about it?
It's an excellent question. I wish I knew the answer, but here's some ideas. One of the problems is that universities have been taken over by a strange, unelected cadre of bureaucrats who are not in the chain of command from the kind of professors through deans to presidents, but the human subjects bureaucracy, the diversity bureaucracy, the sexual harassment bureaucracy, the various other federal mandates that have to be implemented, and they kind of travel horizontally from university to university. They have their own conferences, their own professional societies, and they have I think we're all too ready to outsource the running of the university to these bureaucrats, and they have their own religion as to what a university education should be, namely to protect students' feelings, to advance racial equality, to fight racism, and they're not, they haven't thought through issues like constitutional guarantees, principles of free speech. They've got a limited mandate, and they've got an awful lot of power that somehow, without anyone noticing, we in universities have ceded to them, combined with the lawyers. Harvey Silverblake, the civil liberties lawyer in Massachusetts, says that basically the most important person in a university now is the chief counsel. That a lot of the decisions are made, and people don't realize it, by the top lawyer.
Interesting.
And the university presidents do what the lawyers say you've got to do. So that's an institutional factor. There's also, we don't really know, I haven't seen data, but I'd like to see it on what percentage of the students actually are intolerant. Is it a case of pluralistic ignorance where everyone assumes that everyone else wants to shut down controversial speakers, but the vast majority of people don't want to, but it's the activists who create the trouble, and since everyone assumes that everyone else is an activist, we don't realize how small a sector of the undergraduate population that is. Kind of like what's been claimed for binge drinking on campus. Very few people actually think that binge drinking is a good idea, but if you poll students, all the other students say, well, I think it's really disgusting and stupid to party till you puke. But what can I do? All the other students think that it's really cool. And you poll all the students, and each one thinks that all the other students think that, and no one really thinks that. So I suspect that some of that is going on in terms of this enforcement of an orthodoxy, that it may not be anywhere close to a majority or consensus view, but there may be a core of activists who realize that they can make their lives meaningful, exert power, flex their muscles, and no one's going to push back. So that's a second factor. The third is that great danger that we should be sensitive to and avoid is not to allow free speech to become a right-wing issue. Issues do get branded as left-wing and right-wing. It's not intellectually necessary that they be branded the way they are. So just as an example, environmental protection has become associated with the political left, and the biggest predictor of, say, belief in anthropogenic climate change is not degree of science correlated. The people who believe that man-made climate change don't know any more about science than the people who deny it. But what predicts it perfectly is politics. The farther you are to the right, the more you deny man-made climate change. Same thing with evolution. People who believe in evolution are not scientifically more sophisticated than the people who deny it. But what predicts it is basically, are you religious or secular? So issues, contentful scientific issues can take on a political coloring through, I think, partly historical reasons. Oh, sorry, just to complete the theory about environmentalism used to be a right-wing issue. It used to be seen that way. It was kind of a landed gentry protecting views from the era states and preserving habitats for duck hunting instead of worrying about important issues like the war in Vietnam and racism and poverty. It was kind of considered to be a frivolous luxury to worry about the environment. then that flipped. So anyway, the politics and the issues can join in various combinations, and I think we're seeing a danger of free speech becoming associated with the right, and that would be terrible. So one of the ways to fight back is to remind everyone, students, peers, university bureaucrats especially, that free speech is, and freedom of inquiry, is not just it's not a feel-good slogan. It shouldn't be just a shibboleth of something that we say is good and other people don't care so much about, but it really is prerequisite to doing anything else, simply because you're not infallible, you're not omniscient, I'm not either. So no one should have the mandate to use brute force to shut someone else down on the assumption that they are 100% certain that they're correct. Because history shows that people who were sure that they were correct were not.
Right.
And in fact, in the past, the recognition of human fallibility and limitations of knowledge was essential for a number of progressive causes that we now are grateful for, such as opposition to segregation, and before that slavery, and women's rights and gay rights. If we didn't have freedom of speech 30 or 40 years ago, and those movements could not have gotten off the ground. Right? It's essential to remind people of why free speech is fundamental, not just we insist that it's a good thing, but here's why it's a good thing. And also, and thereby also to tap some of the sentiments, especially among students and younger people, that when if the moral imperative is combating racism, combating sexism, to point out, well, yeah, but we couldn't have done that without free speech in the past.
Right.
And a lot of people's feelings were hurt in the past. A lot of people felt pain to have their ideas of male superiority and white superiority challenged, and too bad for them. It's a good thing that they were hurt and they felt unsafe. But since back then, as now, no one can say that they're omniscient and infallible. That's why we always need the ability to challenge ideas. Kind of get back to the original rationale for freedom of speech.
You know, I have to smile because one of the things that people admire about you is the extent to which you'll change your mind as the data come in. And they shape your views. And I've been told that all of your life, you were raised and grew up around a lot of highly educated, brilliant, and women who had strong opinions. How did that influence you?
Yeah, you didn't time that question so it occurred just as.
What made you think of that?
My sister, who was honored by the Society 3 years ago with the Constance Golden Award.
Right.
Who's a columnist for the Wall Street Journal and author of Sexual Paradox and Visual Effect. And my mother, Rosalind Pinker, in the audience. So, but yes, I grew up with a combination of immediate and frequent interactions with at least two brilliant and forceful women. Because thanks to data and behavioral genetics, I'm intermittently skeptical of the impact of family influence. The peer culture, and this is a lesson that I learned from Judith Rich Harris, who argued that a lot of environmental effects that we tend to attribute to parents are probably better attributed to the peer culture. But of course, her arguments pertain to the kinds of things that we can measure psychometrically, like I don't know if attitudes towards women fall into that category, and it may be that there is more influence from the family for something like that. But I also grew up in my formative years were the years that the second wave of feminism started to become mainstream. And it was, even as a teenager, in an era in which, I was born in 1954, probably the cresting of second wave feminism kind of began, I would say, around 1970. Even though there were obviously precursors, Simone de Beauvoir, and Betty Friedan in the 50s and 60s, but it really kind of hit the national stage starting in the 70s. And at the time, I mean, those of us who lived through it remember that women's rights were considered a kind of a joke, a laughing stock. It was women's livers and the hairy armpits and burning their bras. It was kind of a source of comedy. And I do remember at the age of 15, kind of in a late night bull session with a friend of mine, just listening to music. And that kind of makes sense to me. Kind of reasonable. I said, yeah, I've been thinking the same thing. So I feel part of I think the first, not everyone in my generation went through that epiphany, but I kind of grew up with the idea, starting as a teenager, of that equality of the sexes was just part of the air we breathed. It was a change in the culture that that grew as I grew up. And that, I think, combined with my family experience, kind of led me to, I call myself a feminist. I believe that men and women are not, are distinguishable, they're not indistinguishable, and my argument has always been that has nothing to do with feminism as a political and moral issue. I'll mention one other anecdote which would be consistent with the idea that my family upbringing had. I remember having a conversation with a magazine editor. He said, did you have a sister? You grew up with a sister? I said, yeah, I have a sister and a brother. He said, oh, I thought so. I said, oh, well, why? He said, well, you speak to women as if they're human beings. Which I was...
What year was this?
This was in the 90s. That's right.
Interesting.
Which, by the way, also shows that despite the fact that I said that I kind of grew up in an era in which women's rights were ascending, clearly the fact that she felt that called attention to it.
Absolutely.
That we had a long way to go then, and we have a long way to go now.
Yeah.
And for all the progress, which the other side of me, together with arguing for the existence of human nature that doesn't change quickly, but another side of me plots human dimensions of human progress. In my book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, I documented that any quantifiable measure of violence has gone down over the course of history. And in my next book, coming out in February, I plot a number of other dimensions of human progress. Education, of course, the Flynn effect being another dimension of human flourishing that's increased. But poverty, literacy, happiness, opportunities for experience. But one of them is that sexist attitudes have definitely gone down. But they're still nowhere near zero, as any woman in this audience will attest, and as this magazine editor reminded me. But the progress is unmistakable. And even though it's kind of funny, it almost sounds reactionary to say that we've made progress. It seems that progressives are the people who are most militant about the fact that progress doesn't exist. But I'm someone who believes both in human nature and in the reality of progress. And you can plot it in just any measure of attitudes towards women. There has been, you just can see the curve going down, sexist attitudes. I'm still very far above zero, but much better than it used to be.
Right. Stephen, who were your scientific role models?
I've had influences. I don't know about role models. That almost anyone who's influenced me, I've departed from in various ways.
Sure.
But I've had a number of teachers. As an undergraduate, Al Bregman here at McGill University was my undergraduate advisor. He's a brilliant researcher in auditory perception, and I did work in his lab on how the brain organizes the auditory input to distinguish the different voices of musical instruments or background sounds. But Al was interested in cognition more generally, cognitive psychology. I was fortunate, again, since we're speaking here at McGill, although D.O. Hebb, the great theoretical neuroscientist, psychologist. He was emeritus when I was an undergraduate.
Okay.
But he was still around, and I heard him speak a couple of times. I never heard Wilder Penfield speak, but I did hear Brenda Milner, maybe in this very room. So those were, and the late John McNamara was one of my teachers at McGill, Tom Schultz. Then in graduate school, Steve Costlin was my PhD advisor, a pioneer in the study of mental imagery. My postdoc advisor was Joan Bresnan, a linguist who had trained with Noam Chomsky, but then developed her own rival theory of grammar that I was trained in. So those are my immediate mentors. Among the people who have influenced me in various intellectual ways, they're some of the founders of cognitive science: George Miller, Marvin Minsky, Herb Simon, Alan Newell, Noam Chomsky, Jerry Fodor, the philosopher Hilary Putnam. In evolutionary psychology, my friends John Tooby and Lita Cosmides, but also Donald Simons and Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, and then the people who inspired them: Robert Trivers, Richard Dawkins, George Williams. In individual differences, Judith Harris in her book The Nurture Assumption, but Bob Plomin, Tom Bouchard, Matt McGew, the classic, I'm not really sure called classic, but it's still around.
Yeah.
But then, in almost any area, one of the reasons that I have, I think, explored different areas is that I feel, after a while, that I've kind of devoured the really interesting, original, profound, unusual ideas in a field, and then I don't get exactly bored, but I get curious.
Yeah.
I want to find the big ideas from other fields.
Right.
And so I switch, and I'm voracious for ideas that seem to have powerful ramifications.
Right. Do you have any professional regrets?
Well, do I have any professional regrets that I want to share with several on video? You know, I should probably say no, simply because I'm very aware of how fortunate I am, how lucky I am. I'm in the unusual situation of having a tenured professorship at an American university in the early 21st century.
Privilege.
Which is a privilege, one that I don't take for granted, and especially in this economy, to have almost lifetime job security, benefits, salary, and summers to do what I want, and intellectual freedom, which is still, despite the threats, still extraordinary at American and Canadian universities.
Right.
For all the threats,
Right.
You can still explore controversial topics. So to go back and say, who knows what I would have done differently that could have made, a lot of things could have been worse in my life, and so I'm actually grateful for the things that went well. And that's why I find it hard to answer that question.
Yeah, I understand. This might be a little embarrassing, but you don't have to be right about it in terms of its impact. But what are you proudest of when you look at your professional productions?
Probably the Better Angels of Our Nature. I wouldn't have said that I came out in 2011.
Right.
And even until recently, I probably would not have said that. I probably would have said How the Mind Works,
Okay.
book where I try to integrate all of psychology and evolution and genetics and anthropology. But Better Angels of Our Nature seems to have had a rippling effect that I did not anticipate, and I think leads to, or at least leads to, but encourages or makes plausible a progressive vision of the human condition. That is, it holds out the hope that for all of the troubles that face us, for all the challenges, for all the reasons that we could be fatalistic or pessimistic, the historical data show that we can make things better, and we have in the past. This is not a utopian hope. This is not a sunny aspiration. This is cold, hard data. And it suggests that we could achieve more in the future. And this is what a number of people seem to have taken from it. It's the theme that I have tried to extend in the next book. And so that seems to be larger than many of my other projects. I didn't anticipate it at the time.
Right. The data are fascinating that you present. I have heard critics not denying the argument you make or accepting the data, but expressing concern about what some people might take from that, given that with modern technology, one person can do so much damage now. And worry about that, you know what I mean?
Yeah, it is a question that I take up actually in the forthcoming book.
Okay.
It is raised, namely, as technology empowers people,
Right.
does it follow that more and more can be done with fewer and fewer people until you follow it to its logical conclusion and one person can end the world?
Yes.
A Bulgarian teenager can brew the genocidal virus in his garage.
Yes.
Or develop a nuclear weapon in bedroom.
Yep.
So, we don't know.
Yeah.
There's reason to be skeptical. So Kevin Kelly, the technology expert and the founding editor of Wired magazine, has argued against this just general line of argument in terms of how technology works. It says as technology advances, it actually becomes socially more distributed. That is, anything that is worthwhile is not accomplished by a lone genius. The James Bond villain in his lair, concocting a scheme to take over the world, and all the technology works by magic without a huge support staff. That's just not the way technology develops. That anything you have to do, you rely on a huge network of other people. That network is bound to extend to all of the people who have a stake in keeping society going and intact. And as your conspiracy broadens, there are more opportunities for stings and for defectors and for blunders, which is why, and his perspective is, he was on the ground floor of the personal computer revolution, the internet revolution back in the 80s, and everyone was saying back then, any day now, technology will outrun our capacity to control it, and then there'll be a disaster, the internet will fail, and pandemics will be released. He said that hasn't happened, and doesn't seem to him to be any closer to happening, and it's because of this other narrative of the progress of technology that it becomes socially distributed. As we have a responsible society where there are a lot of people who have an interest in keeping the internet up or keeping epidemics from spreading, then there's only so much damage that the sole James Bond villain could do.
Even when you look back at your career with 20/20 hindsight, would you have any advice for the younger Steven Pinker, the assistant professor starting out?
And I can think of a lot of anxieties that I had then that I could say, things will turn out okay.
Yeah.
Although I wouldn't have believed myself at the time. But again, I feel kind of churlish or ungrateful to
Right.
To try to. I can think of things that I would have done differently, but on the whole, I'm so lucky that I can't really wisely regret it, given how my life has turned out, at least so far.
Okay, well, that's fair enough. I have, before we open this up to the audience, I have one question that I know many people in the audience will value your response to, and that is, we have a lot of young academics in the audience, and postdocs and assistant profs, and because this is an intelligence conference, I'll focus it on intelligence, but you can generalize freely to young academic careers. What advice would you give to young academics nowadays, just starting out?
Well, one is to the maintain an intellectual curiosity about the subject matter that spans academic disciplines. That there are academic disciplines and subdisciplines and sub-subdisciplines. Then there are interesting questions like what is intelligence? And there are academic disciplines that kind of get associated with intellectual questions, but generally the questions overflow and crisscross the academic disciplines. And I think there are always opportunities to draw connections in this particular context, say between psychometrics and cognitive science, or artificial intelligence, or evolutionary biology, or molecular genetics, or neuroscience.
Right.
So that would be the one, to be alert for opportunities to explore questions with the tools of non-traditional disciplines.
Right.
That would be one. Another is, at least in this context, it's everyone is aware of the fact that this is has become a highly politicized topic, and to be neither oblivious nor kind of cringingly apologetic to the political issues, to be aware of them, to not let the political issues deter one from honest research, but not to be oblivious to the fact that people will draw conclusions, and to be aware of what they are, to anticipate them, to try to make arguments that as to why the research is intellectually and practically valuable. I think you just can't do research in this field without being aware of them.
Right.
And that doesn't mean starting off on a point of defensiveness, like, you know, I'm going to talk about intelligence, but no, I'm really not a Nazi. That's kind of not a good strategy. But just to make the most honest argument as to taking into account the risks and benefits for why this is an important intellectual question.
Good. Well, Stephen, this has been a delight, and I think what I would like to do, because I know people have questions for you, is to just open this up to the audience, and I will call on people, because I know there are going to be a number of hands up, and we will field a few questions now. Start out with James Flynn. And James, there's a button on your, everyone has a button, so we can pick this up because we're taping.
As always, when I encounter.
Press the button down.
I did, I thought.
Okay, again.
It shows red.
Oh, keep it.
All right. As always, when I encounter Stephen Pinker's work,
There's so many ideas.
you want to comment on a lot of things, but one I wanted to pick up on having to do with the lack of intelligent debate on university campuses. And a lot of this, of course, is repression. But you mentioned one
People in women's studies.
who are intolerant of speech they disagree with. You point out that women's studies would never existed if there had been a similar intolerance of, unpopular ideas 40 years ago. And I find that to talk to students about what happened 40 years ago, you might as well be describing the evolution of microbes on Venus. It's an ahistorical generation. And much of the poverty of debate on campus is that by now, most academics are ahistorical and semi-illiterate. And they're turning out students that are ahistorical and semi-illiterate. And this means that informed debate on a whole range of issues is virtually impossible, not because of speech codes, but just because of the poverty of intellect at universities. And as you know, I have a bit of a crusade on that subject. But it's one that's often neglected. Much of the poverty of debate in university is just that staff are narrowly vocational. They have no awareness of history or of world literature, and they turn out students who are just the same, And any argument that goes back more than 10 years is just not an argument that gets any resonance.
Yeah, well, I'm always, I'm sympathetic to what is often deficient about university education, including the historical shallowness. And it's not just university education, I think it's intellectual life more generally, such as the op-eds that you read in the New York Times or the Guardian or any of our popular magazines. I've become sensitive to this, having plotted rates of violence over time, that, and most of which have gone down, you know, with a lot of wiggles and occasional spikes. But it is remarkable to read even our most esteemed op-ed columnists talked about how the world today is, you know, never seen as much war, and which is just dead wrong. It just, you forgot about all those other wars that are over that killed far more people, like, you know, the Iran-Iraq War, which killed 500,000 people in the 1980s. The Vietnam War killed 10 times as many people as the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. So there's a lot of historical amnesia, which I think is regrettable, combined with a kind of innumeracy where we know as psychologists that people are influenced by available examples, diversity in Kahneman's availability heuristic. If something pops into mind, you assume that it's frequent. You read about a shark attack, you assume that lots of people get eaten by sharks. You don't read about car accidents or falling off ladders, you don't realize how many people die falling off ladders. I'm always, though, for that very reason, I always hesitate before talking about the current generation, because I'm a baby boomer and we weren't so historically deep either. And our generation was pretty intolerant of certainly the protests against Richard Herrnstein and E.O. Wilson. Those took place in the 70s, decades before the millennials were born. So it's a perennial problem. Maybe it's worse. I'm not convinced that it's necessarily worse, but it is a problem. And I agree that historical depth and statistical depth should be much more of an essential part of undergraduate education, and of intellectual discourse more generally. And so your various defenses of liberal, humane ideals, understanding current events in historical context, I applaud. I think we need much more of that.
Toby?
Yeah. When I interviewed you for The Spectator about a year ago, you said that your next book was going to be a kind of defense of Western values and Western civilization.
Not Western, Enlightenment.
Enlightenment, okay.
West has always been squirrely about the Enlightenment.
Okay, Enlightenment values. You've been very successful in your career to date in avoiding antagonizing the campus thought police and avoiding meeting the fate of the Richard Herrnsteins and E.O. Wilsons. But if you do write a book, I mean, if this forthcoming book makes a positive case for, okay, not Western values, but Enlightenment values, that seems to be something that's pretty controversial. As we've heard, the climate on current university campuses in America is more intolerant than it was. Do you think, actually, your luck might run out with this new book?
I think it could. I choose my, I manage my controversy portfolio carefully. I've staked out a number of controversial positions and that have had pushback. But I remember a bit of advice from my late philosopher Robert Nozick. He was at Harvard, died about 15 years ago. He said, you don't have to have an opinion on everything. And so there are certain topics where I just haven't expressed a public opinion on. No one would say that I'm not an opinionated person. But I think it's important not to kind of fly off and embrace every controversial position in which one is. So I don't know. It's possible. It's what I'm hoping is that since even though many people in fact are opposed to Enlightenment values, by Enlightenment values I provisionally define them for the sake of the book reason, science, humanism, and progress. But particularly reason, science, and humanism, the Enlightenment idea being that leads to progress, those three. In fact, those are much more controversial than people admit in practice. There aren't a whole lot of people, not that many saying I'm against the Enlightenment, I'm anti-Enlightenment. A lot are, but it hasn't become a hot button by its name. So I'm hoping there'll be some degree of stealth, that people will, like the character in the Moliere play, who's delighted to discover that he's been speaking prose all his life. I'm hoping that people will realize that they've been humanists all their lives without necessarily assuming the label. But we'll see. Maybe my luck will run out.
Rich?
I'd like to ask you about the blank slate. With respect to your comment about the ripples, the positive ripples caused by better angels of our nature, did the blank slate have similar ripples? Because I would have hoped it had big ripples. Did it, or did it not?
I think it had some. I think that I like to think that it had some. It was just republished last year in a new edition with an afterword, where I tried to update the conclusions from the book, including many of them coming out of research from people in this room. In one sense, the fact that we've had this new wave of intolerance would say, nothing has changed. On the other hand, if, as I suspect, the intolerance comes from a kind of highly empowered minority, but that from the majority there isn't the same, I'd like to think there isn't the same knee-jerk opposition to the very idea of innate individual differences, innate sex differences that there was in the 80s and 90s, maybe we had some inroads. And there have been some surveys of the presence of blank slate beliefs in, say, surveys of textbooks and so on, which suggests that it still very much is a widespread dogma, but that there has been movement. And I think you see this in mainstream discussions, say just in picking up the Globe and Mail or the Guardian or the New York Times, but some issues that just would have been radioactive in the 1970s, such as evolutionary explanations for behavior or sex differences. Now I think they sometimes, depending on the context, they can be discussed not as controversial topics where the news is those ideas, but the ideas themselves are part of a larger discussion and can be used to make an argument without themselves being identified as raging controversies. So some, not enough.
Yeah, we haven't quite seen that in intelligence yet, but we're all hoping for it.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if anyone in this room or who contributes to this literature has kind of done a survey of textbooks or popular press treatments of intelligence.
We had a paper on that.
We just had a presentation on it.
Well, I'd like to get a copy of that. So my sense is just looking at, I teach introductory psychology and I have for 20 years. The textbook that I use, admittedly not randomly selected, but has a very, I think, scientifically accurate treatment of intelligence and heritability of intelligence, personality, and psychopathology. I doubt you would have seen when I was an undergraduate, but I don't know what the overall trends are.
You'll get that.
I'll email it to you.
Send it to me, please, yeah.
Linda?
Yes, maybe only you can have the evidence on this, but my sense is that when someone eminent and writes a book that's well-reasoned, they provide cover for other people, in a sense. They say, wow, someone said that, right? And it gives them confidence. They can always turn to you, say, well, he said it, right? But you might know, or you might have been told by people, thank you, or that sort of thing. Because sometimes people who speak out and get away with it provide great comfort and encouragement to other people who think they couldn't have done that. But they're encouraged in their own lives now, in their own jobs, to do more of that. You get any of that? A lot of it?
It's pleasing for me to think that, yes. So I hope so.
Do people say that, though?
Sometimes, yeah.
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 There's a vast
Yeah.
underground silent majority, is my sense, and you only hear about it when someone kind of sticks their neck out and people say, wow, great.
In a way, I know that I've taken on these controversial topics and have gotten, I don't think we understand why, just taking this particular controversies that everyone in this room is concerned with. Some people seem to completely float above controversy, even though they have made claims that are within the mainstream of scientific consensus, but controversial outside the field. So Ian Geary, for example, not pulled any punches, has made it plain, explains pretty clearly without apologizing, and I don't think he has, at least he told me several years ago that he's never been focus of controversy. I have been, not as much as some people like Charles Murray or you, partly because there are certain topics that I don't take positions on. I haven't written on race and intelligence, knowing that is a third rail, and it's one of those topics, as Nozick advised, that I don't have to have an opinion on. So it involves some sensitivity also as to what is controversial and what is radioactive.
And what you can contribute to best, presumably. And what you can contribute to best.
I think.
And it would include topics that you could contribute to most.
Yes, where they.
I'm not going to write a book on linguistics, you know.
I think I make a positive.
Hi, I was going to try and ask a Pinker family question, because when a family is introduced with achievements, someone like me thinks, well, genetics, it's a family. And it's interesting because you'd said earlier in your talk, we have to look at this issue of the non-shared variance. I mean, is it noise, or is it that people are creating their own niches, and these are the unique ones, and they're not unique ones, well, they're just another version of genetics. We may be underestimating the real genetic effect. So I'd like your answer on it, and I'm quite happy if you're interrupted by two other people as you give the answer. But when you think of your history, do you think of it in the way that David's asking, then I made this decision, then I made that decision, things had an impact on me, in the way that I and others would often think, if I hadn't gone to that school, if I'd had this particular brain, that was the reason. That's the reason why I incidentally haven't written a best-selling book in psychology. It's the school, all right? So are we going to be, first of all, do we need to rethink the way we're doing our analysis of variance to include self-created niches? And then also, are we going to start re-evaluating the way we talk about our family histories and life? And we'll start saying, I came from such and such a family, my ancestors were these, that's why I'm literary, that's why I do things, as opposed to, hey, I worked, I followed the advice of my tutors, and things develop from there.
I think those are all profound questions. So, I mean, in my case, again, each one of us is particularly ill-equipped to explain what made us what we are, because we don't have the relevant contrasts. I don't know what would happen if I had an identical twin who would be
Deep storage. You need 100 for all the cases.
Exactly. One wouldn't be enough. Also, the conclusions, the so-called three laws of behavioral genetics, pertain largely to the things that are easily that are measured. There are many things that aren't measured, that are not personality dimensions or intelligence dimensions, but that are part of what make us what we are. So I mentioned, for example, that I read an article in the New York Times Magazine about Noam Chomsky when I was a college freshman. Well, my parents subscribed to the New York Times magazine, and if it weren't for that, maybe I would not have read that article. And I grew up in a house with encyclopedias and books and arguments over the dinner table, and that may or may not have affected my level of intelligence or my Big Five personality scores, but it may have influenced my curiosity about human nature as opposed to geology or classics. Very, very hard to reconstruct. So I suspect that it has, the conclusions about the limits of familial influence, which do pertain to personality and intelligence, may not pertain to other particulars of a life, which clearly are influenced by family upbringing. Questions like, and I guess this would be part of my answer to your question of what would be, where should the field, where would I hope the field would go? The questions like, so this big, I call it the Mr. Jones factor from Bob Dylan. Something is happening here, but you don't know what it is, do you, Mr. Jones? The so-called unexplained variance, the non-shared environment. What do we mean when we talk about that? We can't. We often talk about niche construction or gene-environment interactions, but to the extent that that is itself, as you point out, partly a function of our genetic makeup, that variance would just get kind of sucked up in the genetic contribution anyway. So even if the causal pathway involves a back and forth with the environment, it doesn't account for this unexplained dimension of individual variation. When I say, well, I think a lot of that is due to chance, well, what does chance actually mean? It's not, quantum mechanics and irreducible probability, but chance often means lots and lots of little causal influences that we can't identify. So things like, well, if I hadn't picked up the magazine that happened to be on the coffee table that day, my life could have gone in a different direction. There's a sense in which that's chance from the bird's eye view, but there's a sense in which it's completely deterministic from what happened in my brain at that moment. So I think there are a lot of questions like that. There are chance events in, of course, as we know, and this is a big theme of the afterward to the blank slate, that there's a sense in which the effects of genetics can be underestimated if by classic twin and adoption studies, if we don't take into account both new mutations that are introduced in generation and somatic mutations in the development of the brain in the first few years of life. So it could be that, say, our identical twins are not genetically identical, in which case since it's the differences between identical twins reared together that give us that non-shared variance term, maybe it's not that as genetic if identical twins aren't genetically indistinguishable. And others might be dubiously environmental if they had to do with, even quite apart from genetic differences. If with identical genomes, some axons zig in one twin and zag in another, it may be biologically determined at the microscopic level, random at the macroscopic level, not really environmental by any conventional definition of the environment other than ungenetic. These are all, I think, fascinating questions, none of them easy to study. I mean, none of which we can answer just with classic methods, twins and adoptees, but I think just scientifically.
In the back? You?
Hello. We've heard the good news, as Linda would call it, so the progressive take on these trends, the declining, the better angels of our nature, the declining intra and intergroup violence. And you say you're producing another book where you're looking at extending the nomological net of these trends. Well, to that I would say, what about the bad news? Because coexisting in time with these trends are other trends, such as now several phenotypic and now even genotypic indicators that G may be in decline. Measures of social alienation, declining population in the industrialized regions of the world, these sort of things, possible mutation load increases, etc. Could it be that some of these indicators of decline are masked, essentially, by these indicators of progress? Or could it even be, and I'm going to say something controversial, and most people who know me know I'm not controversial at all, could it be that some of these declension indicators might actually be byproducts or a function of this progress of which you speak?
So a number of things. So what the way I think of it is not so much whether there are positive developments that mask negative developments, but that progress is always the balance between positive and negative developments. That solutions to problems always create new problems, and there's a constant process of solving the new problems that arise as solutions to old problems. So whether they're, in terms of the phenotypic increase in intelligence, the Flynn effect, I think it had to be obvious that, I think it's called Stein's law, things that can't go on forever don't. So the Flynn effect is obviously subject to Stein's law with Davy's corollary, which is things that can't go on forever can go on longer than you think they can. So, I myself don't have a sense as to whether any kind of dysgenic effects are, how strong they are, how likely they are to persist, whether if there is a problem of declining birth rates in industrial populations, that itself may not be a problem that can be solved by changing incentives for having children. We know from comparisons across European countries that Western European countries with similar levels of affluence and education can have different birth rates, in part because of inscrutable cultural differences, in part because of different incentives as to how much of a pain in the neck is it to have a baby, how accessible is healthcare, how much of a hit do you take here. By you, I mean typically more often women than men. So it's possible to change policies in a way that might push back against some of the problems that come from a declining birth rate. In terms of mutational load, it's very hard to know how that weighs against the advances in medical care, including in the future, including perhaps, who knows, ways of making up for mutational load by pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, so that if you are carrying a mutation, you don't choose the zygote that has the double dose of that recessive gene. Something that I'm actually aware of myself, since I and my wife are both carriers of a gene for familial dysautonomia. We met too late to have children, but if we did today's technology, we could be guaranteed of not having a child with familial dysautonomia, something that would not have been true 20 years ago. So I guess my general answer is, it would be magic if every trend was positive. I mean, that just can't happen when God doesn't smile on us. So the question is, will we continue to be clever enough that the negative trends can be counteracted by even stronger positive developments?
Well, okay. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Thank you, David.
James.
Fine, thanks very much, yeah. Hello.